For this unit, our next assessment objective states, candidates should be able to show detailed understanding of the ways in which choices of form, structure, and language shape meanings. There are loads of different types of poetry, and I really hope you've enjoyed reading them during your course. But if knowing all the correct names for types of verse, metre and rhyme seems daunting at first, remember, this kind of labelling or tagging is not as important as reading closely and trying to enjoy, understand and interpret a poem's meaning. In this session, we will be looking at two sonnets, one written by William Wordsworth and mentioned previously, and one written by Carol Ann Duffy, a contemporary poet.
A sonnet is a 14-line form of verse. Shakespearean sonnets typically had 12 lines with 2 rhyming lines at the end. Petrarchan or Italian sonnets are typically divided into a group of 8 lines, the octave, followed by 6 lines, the sestet. We will be using these to plan what strategies we might use to explore their language and meaning before we write about them in detail. In the first sonnet, we are going to try and persuade you that it is fairly easy to make sense of unfamiliar language. Don't let apparently old-fashioned word choice and usage put you off. There will normally be important and recognisable clues about the meaning of a poem despite some unfamiliar words.
What I would try to do is use the context and the bits of the poem that you do understand confidently to help you figure out the rest. Try to be painstaking when you are unravelling a poet's ideas and feelings. Stick with it. Read each poem with your inner voice during your revision. Try not to translate too much. Become familiar with the different forms of expression and ideas as they stand. So, let's get to grips with William Wordsworth. Travelling home from a stay in London in a carriage early in the morning, he was struck by the way the quality of light seemed to reflect on the city.
Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. The city now doth, like a garment wear, the beauty of the morning, silent, bare. Ships, towers, domes, theatres and temples lie, open into the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendour, valley, rock or hill. Ne'er saw I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still.
The first thing to do is reread the poem, working out what the more archaic or old-fashioned word choices and syntax mean from the sound and the context. Let's quickly run through these in the poem. Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. Here, Wordsworth has used a typical poetic reversal of word order for emphasis. What he means is that if anyone could cross the bridge without noticing the beautiful sight he has just seen, that man would have a dull or boring soul. The city now doth, like a garment, wear the beauty of the morning. You simply need to know that this is the old-fashioned form of does. This form continued to be thought of as proper poetic language for another century. Silent, bare. Ships, towers, domes, theatres and temples lie open unto the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air.
London was much smaller at the turn of the 19th century and was, believe it or not, surrounded by fields and marshes. It would be fine to comment upon this as a startling feature of the poem. Today we would use open to rather than unto. Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendour, valley, rock or hill. This is another example of Wordsworth's use of inverted word order, which exaggerates the poetic effect of his ecstatic response to the early morning sights. This was when neither household nor industrial fires had yet obscured the view. Simply practice turning the words round as you read them until the syntax makes sense. For example, the sun never steeped valleys, rocks or hills more beautifully in its first or early morning splendour.
He means here that the sight of London in front of him is as beautiful as his beloved Lake District. Okay, this lacks the punch and awe of the original poem, but you may need to go through this process to get the gist of Wordsworth's feelings and meaning before you revisit the poem and experience its full force. The use of his as a possessive pronoun shows how male the accepted viewpoints of the time were. What difference might the use of the personification her have made to the poem here? Could a woman not shed splendour on the world?
Ne'er saw I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. Here we can see further similar use of negatives and inversions. Put simply, it means, I never saw and I never felt such a deep calm. But without the rhythmic stresses of the original and the effect of the rhyme scheme, the line loses its emphatic force. Glideth is another old-fashioned form of what was considered appropriate poetic use of language throughout most of the 19th century. Our modern use of the third-person singular verb is glides, so wherever you see eth, it normally denotes a pre-20th century poem. But never fall into the trap of saying that Wordsworth uses archaic language. Remember, these old-fashioned forms were not old-fashioned at the time he was writing.
It is not just aspects of Wordsworth's language that are unfamiliar to us. In our much more secular and cynical times, we tend to be culturally cool and ironic about showing strong emotions or enthusiasms. The so-called romantic poets tended not to be so inhibited. They were struck by the beauty of nature and some of the wonders of the built world, and expressed their adoration for the beautiful effusively, sometimes with religious fervour. Wordsworth uses the expression "dear God" in order to convey to the listener or reader of his poem the religious or mystical effect the scene had upon him. Here, you might want to go back to Fred Daguiar's poem and compare and contrast the effects the two poets achieve through their different choices of structure and their different perceptions, working out for yourself the way different social contexts impinge upon the writing of the poems. Now we will move on to the sonnet Anne Hathaway by Carol Ann Duffy. Imagine you have been asked the following question in the examination. Remind yourself of the poem Anne Hathaway. To what extent do you agree with the view that, in terms of subject matter and style, this poem is key to the collection of Duffy's poems in The World's Wife?
The bed we loved in was a spinning world of forests, castles, torchlight, cliff-tops, seas, where he would dive for pearls. My lover's words were shooting stars, which fell to earth as kisses on these lips. My body, now a softer rhyme to his, now echo, assonance. His touch, a verb dancing in the centre of a noun. Some nights I dreamed he'd written me the bed, a page beneath his writer's hands. Romance and drama played by touch, by scent, by taste. In the other bed, the best, our guests dozed on, dribbling their prose. My living, laughing love, I hold him in the casket of my widow's head, as he held me upon that next best bed.
If we were studying Carol Ann Duffy's collection of poems, The World's Wife, and trying to answer the examination question, we would first need to look carefully at how the relevant assessment objectives were encoded in the question. First, dig out the keywords to keep at the forefront of our planning, since they have been designed to help us be successful. Would you have highlighted the following keywords? Remind yourself of the poem Anne Hathaway. To what extent do you agree with the view that, in terms of subject matter and style, this poem is key to the collection of Duffy's poems in The World's Wife? This question is asking you to do 3 different things. First, to analyse the given poem in terms of subject matter and style through the selection of some appropriate detail. Then, to debate the viewpoint linking your argument and analysis closely through making connections with other poems and showing you have studied the rest of the collection. This debate should not be tackled in a separate paragraph as an afterthought, but integrated in a balanced way throughout the essay. Finally, you will need to formulate an overview of Duffy's persistent ideas and themes in the collection of poems as you develop your argument. The art of careful planning and selection will be crucial here. First, we suggest you interrogate the poem itself, using the same areas for questioning as before, but making sure you closely link each section to the viewpoint you have been given in the question. What immediately strikes you about the poem? It is a lyrical poem of love, death, memories of love-making and loss, closest in mood and tone to the gentler poems in the collection, Demeter, Penelope, Elvis's twin sister, and Mrs. Beast. Anne Hathaway's references to the language and magic of Shakespeare's plays, forests, castles, torchlight cliff-tops, seas where he would die for pearls, are genuine and admiring. However, this poem is not really representative of the fiercer, angrier voices used by Duffy in Mrs. Sisyphus, Mrs. Aesop, Salome, and Mrs. Quasimodo. It directly contrasts the violence in Little Redcap. I took an axe to the wolf as he slept, one chop, scrotum to throat. What has the poet written about? Duffy has written about Anne Hathaway's memories as a widow, about the legacy of the bed and what it represents to her, her living, laughing love, and her lively and passionate memories of lovemaking. The poem challenges the common perception that this seemed a miserly bequest. Anne Hathaway seems to be mocking the materialistic view that the other bed, the best, should have been left to her, since to her this bed was inferior, used only for guests dribbling their prose or unable to make love as miraculously as they did. There is a touch of the knowing, satirical humour which Duffy exploits in many of the other poems in the collection. But the humour is not used as bitingly here as in Frau Freud, who is sick up to here with all the ridiculous male metaphors for penis. Duffy's offhand ridicule in this poem, her sharp but simple device of listing all these not pretty colloquial terms, builds to secure a feminist superiority, a mere feeling of pity for the male organ.
Anne Hathaway, however, as Shakespeare's wife, shows genuine and unconditional acceptance of her husband as she celebrates their passion. Some nights I dreamed he'd written me, the bed a page beneath his writer's hands. The open, reciprocated desire and delight of this poem does not reflect the majority of the poems in the collection. Here, wives either pretend to enjoy sex, as in Pygmalion's Bride, my heart was ice, was glass, or are relieved not to have to undergo sex, as Mrs. Rip Van Winkle was, when her husband fell asleep for 100 years. But what was best, what hands down beat the rest, was saying a none too fond farewell to sex.
How has the poet positioned the voice of the poem? The voice in the poem is that of Anne Hathaway, Shakespeare's wife. Duffy's use of this device is key to the collection, to the extent that Duffy, in the majority of the poems, allows the previously silenced voice of a famous man's wife to speak out. Through this startling, original, and often irreverent device, Duffy rewrites literary history, reclaiming the hidden voices of a line of ghosts unable to win, Mrs. Beast. The dominant male voices of the canon of literature are replaced, often scurrilously, by words for the lost, the captive beautiful, the wives, those less fortunate than we.
Anne Hathaway shows no resentment or blame towards her man, unlike many of the other wives. For example, it didn't take Mrs. Quasimodo long to spot how dissatisfied with her Quasimodo was becoming. Something had changed, or never been. Soon enough, he started to find fault. This poem ends tragically with a string of self-directed, unpleasant, animalistic curses, an ecstasy of loathing, leaving Mrs. Quasimodo blaming herself and her physical appearance for the faults in the relationship.
In this poem, Anne Hathaway's voice seems to be self-possessed yet practical in her grief. Her whole-hearted love, wonder, and unconditional acceptance of her husband may mean she is still a little in awe of their passionate lovemaking, but the poem celebrates its beauty, and she recalls playing as full and imaginative a part in it as he did. Some nights, I dreamed he'd written me, the bed a page beneath his writer's hands. The suggestion here is that the sensuality and vigour of their lovemaking were indistinguishable from the power of the imagination. Romance and drama played by touch, by scent, by taste. This may differ in tone from the satirical way many of the collection's more bitter, scornful and revengeful poems about the concepts of romance and love have been written. The voices of many of Duffy's other wives' monologues snarl, are bored, or take delight in pointing up their husband's failings.
The sound of the poem moves eloquently and expressively, drawing on the carefully structured, regular metre of the sonnet form. In places, the soft, flexible rhythms used by Duffy suggest the actions of lovemaking. His touch, a verb dancing in the centre of a noun. Other poetic effects, such as assonance, rhyme, words described as kisses, are all mentioned actively and metaphorically by the voice in the poem, suggesting the couple were closely matched in their understanding of the creativity, fertility, and imagination involved in lovemaking, drama, and writing. Assonance refers to the device whereby vowel sounds are repeated in a sentence or a line of poetry. Duffy does not use any of the predictable rhyming structures of the sonnet until the final two lines, which rhyme. This device possibly reminds us of the end of one of Shakespeare's scenes or plays, but also marks the finality of Shakespeare's death. The impressive final metaphor of the casket or coffin is transformed by Duffy into a casket Anne Hathaway locks away in her mind, snapping the poem and the memory shut. I hold him in the casket of my widow's head, as he held me upon that next best bed. There is none of Medusa's regret here, her anguish at her betrayal and jealousy of younger women. Wasn't I beautiful? Wasn't I fragrant and young? Or the callous and indifferent viciousness of Salome when she flings back the sticky red sheets. And there, like I said, and ain't life a bitch, was his head on a platter. How has the poet structured or patterned the poem? The sonnet revolves around the bed and its significance to Anne Hathaway, beginning and ending with a mention of it. Her memories of their lovemaking are illuminated by Duffy's references to the language and magic of Shakespeare's plays. My lover's words were shooting stars which fell to earth as kisses. The tone of the poem is compact and like an elegy. An elegy is a formal poem of lament or sorrow normally addressed to a particular person. Although lonely, Anne Hathaway is composed and self-possessed. Duffy frequently reflects the loneliness of other women and their ways of coping with it. In her Penelope, the voice relies on her art, her tapestry, to occupy her. I sewed a girl under a single star-crossed stitch, silver silk running after childhood's bouncing ball. In Elvis's twin sister, Duffy shows how convent life means Sister Presley copes cheerfully in her land of grace. I'm alive and well. Long time since I walked down Lonely Street.
And now for the conclusion. Duffy's spirited depiction of the couple's rare happiness in their spinning world in Anne Hathaway may be key to the collection to the extent that its different in tone provides a glimpse of perfection, of beauty, happiness and regeneration, as a touchstone or a reassurance against the bleaker views of the world. In the final poem, Demeter, which also ends with a rhyme, she sees Persephone walking towards her. The blue sky smiling, none too soon, with the small shy mouth of a new moon. Perhaps Duffy is suggesting that despite all the repression of the women, the agony, violence, jealousy and betrayal they have suffered, Anne Hathaway represents a centre of hope within the poems, similar to that she depicts in Penelope's tapestry. I was picking out the smile of a woman at the centre of this world, self-contained, absorbed, content. So, poems can be fun, and you can challenge the views of the examiners, but be polite.